A widower, lonely in his imposing mansion, he opened the door to a starving woman begging to clean his house in exchange for food. But when his eyes met those of the child in her arms, in that devastating instant, his empire of solitude crumbled like a sandcastle. His heart recognized a secret the past had refused to bury, and nothing would ever be the same. Before we begin this emotional story of love, forgiveness, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any incredible stories. And in the comments, let me know, do you believe in second chances at love? Leave your opinion. Now grab your tissues and let's get to the story. The morning sun pierced through the glass walls of Arthur's mansion, flooding the living room with a white, unforgiving light that exposed every imperfection. To most people, it would be a beautiful, promising day. To Arthur, it was just another day of cruel clarity that exposed the cavernous void of his life. Each sunbeam seemed like a merciless spotlight on the invisible dust dancing in the air, on the deafening absence of laughter, on the monumental and oppressive silence of the house that felt more like a mausoleum. Today, the silence was even heavier, almost palpable. It had been exactly 3 years since his wife Helen had left this world. He stood paralyzed before a large digital photo frame on the Italian marble fireplace. Images of Helen cycled in a silent, hypnotic loop. Helen smiling radiantly on a boat off the Italian coast. Helen elegantly cutting the ribbon to open a new wing of the hospital they had funded together. Helen stunning at their wedding, her eyes shining with happiness and ambition. She had been a good woman, unquestionably, a brilliant and strategic business partner, the sophisticated architect of much of his social and professional life. He missed her, a polished, respectful, almost ceremonial kind of missing. But if he were brutally honest with himself, the pain he felt was that of a man who had lost a valuable accomplice, not a man who had lost his soulmate. Because his soul he had left behind in a small, dusty town, 9 years earlier, in the hands of another woman. The bright sun outside didn't remind him of glamorous Italy with Helen. It reminded him of another sun, a hotter, more brutal and unforgiving sun, the sun that mercilessly punished the dirt roads of his hometown. And that burning sun inevitably reminded him of Rebecca. He closed his eyes tightly, and the memory his most faithful and cruel enemy violently assaulted him. He saw himself at 25, a thin, hungry young man with calloused hands from hard work and dreams much bigger than his empty pockets. And he saw Rebecca, radiant at 19, her long, silky black hair, her skin tanned by the country sun, her smile that seemed to carry all the light and hope in the world. They were sitting on the bank of a calm river, sharing a warm bottle of soda, their eyes shining as they planned a life they would never have. Their love was the only truly valuable thing they owned in that life of scarcity. It was a desperate and pure love, forged in absolute poverty, a small, fragile boat trying to survive in a violent ocean of hardship. Then came the opportunity that would change everything. A rare scholarship to a prestigious university in the distant big city, a trainee program at a tech company that promised the impossible, the American dream. It was his only real chance to escape the life of grueling manual labor that patiently awaited him, the same cruel life that had driven his father to exhaustion and an early death. The farewell was the most gut-wrenching, difficult thing he had ever done. "I'll be back, Becca," he had promised fervently, using the intimate nickname only she had ever given him. "I swear on everything that is sacred in this world. I'll study, get a good job, and come running back so we can get married and be happy. Promises are just words on the wind." "Joe," she had replied with wisdom beyond her years, her eyes full of stubborn tears that refused to fall, as if falling meant admitting defeat. "The world out there is big and merciless. It swallows people like us whole without even chewing. It won't swallow me, and I will never forget you," he swore with conviction, holding her face in his hands. He kissed her one last time, slowly, trying to memorize every sensation. The taste of the kiss was mixed with the bitter salt of her tears. He got on the interstate bus with a broken heart and looked back through the foggy window, engraving in his soul the image of her, standing alone in the dust of the bus station, waving desperately until she became just a tiny dot on the distant horizon. The world did indeed swallow him whole. The city, with its mind-numbing speed, its unbridled ambition, its seductive promise of power, was a whirlwind that sucked him in without mercy. He worked like a fiend, studied to the point of exhaustion, slept little, very little. He met Helen at the university. She was the daughter of a powerful industrialist, intelligent, sophisticated, cold, and calculating. And she saw in him the same insatiable hunger that drove her, the same brutal determination. They became ruthless partners in business and eventually in life. The sacred promise he had made to Rebecca gradually became a more and more distant and hazy memory, a romantic dream from another life, from another man, covered by the merciless reality of multi-million-dollar contracts, endless spreadsheets, and the cold, seductive gleam of material success. He told himself repeatedly that Rebecca deserved someone better, someone present who wouldn't make her wait for years. He told himself that she must have already forgotten him completely, found another love. And with this comfortable lie repeated 1,000 times, he methodically built his billion-dollar empire and his new polished life on the deep, forgotten grave of his first and only true love. The shrill sound of the doorbell brutally snatched him from his painful memories, a sharp, insistent sound that broke the silent sanctity of his private morning. His housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, a stern and efficient woman who had been loyally devoted to Helen and now ran the house with almost military efficiency, was not there. It was her sacred day off. Deeply irritated by the unwanted intrusion, Arthur strode firmly through the grand entrance hall. Whoever this inconvenient visitor was, they would be dismissed quickly and with aristocratic coldness. He opened the heavy door with ill-disguised impatience. The midday sun blinded him temporarily. When his eyes finally adjusted to the harsh light, he saw the scene that would irrevocably define the rest of his existence. Standing on his doorstep, under the strong and merciless sun, was a woman who seemed to have stepped directly out of his most painful and buried memories. She was dangerously thin. Her shoulders slumped under the unbearable weight of exhaustion, her face deeply marked by a weariness that went beyond the physical. She held tightly to the hand of a little girl, a girl of perhaps 8, with messy dark hair and frightened, suspicious eyes, who hid instinctively behind her mother's protective legs. They both wore simple, cheap clothes, clean but visibly worn by time and overuse. Discreet patches here and there told stories of struggle. The woman lifted her tired face, and Arthur's heart literally stopped beating for an endless moment. Even with the deep lines of worry etched on her face, with her skin weathered by the sun and suffering, with the youthful glow of her youth completely gone, he recognized her instantly. It was like being struck by lightning. Rebecca. She, however, did not recognize him at first. The man she had known and loved was a thin, awkward boy, with rough hands marked by labor and rebellious hair in the wind. The man before her was an imposing fortress, older, significantly stronger, his hair cut with impeccable precision, his face perfectly shaved, wearing casual clothes that probably cost more than she earned in a full year of hard work. To her, he was just a rich, intimidating stranger, the unreachable owner of that house that looked like a fairy tale palace. Driven by the absolute desperation that had brought her there, knocking from door to door, she finally spoke. Her voice was low and trembling, yet still carried the indomitable strength of a lioness fighting desperately for her cub. "Sir, good morning. Forgive my immense boldness in knocking on your door like this, unannounced. My name is Rebecca. My daughter and I were going through a very, very difficult time." She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I'm not asking for a handout, sir. Please, believe me, I'm asking for a chance, an honest job, anything you can offer me." She looked at the impeccable and intimidating facade of the house, at the gardens perfectly manicured by professional gardeners. "I saw the size of your house, sir. I thought maybe you needed someone to help with the cleaning, the upkeep. I'm a very, very hard worker. I can wash, iron, cook, tend the garden, whatever is absolutely necessary. She swallowed her pride with difficulty. "I don't need a salary right now, sir. Just a plate of food for the two of us, and a minimally safe place for her to sleep tonight. That's all, please." Arthur was physically and completely unable to respond. Her words were a distorted and cruel echo of their old shared dreams. Our house, our life together. And there she was, the woman he had promised a life of happiness, humbly asking to clean his house in exchange for food. Just food. Guilt was a violent poison rising rapidly in his throat, suffocating him, taking his breath away. 12 whole years of meteoric success, of obscene wealth, of absolute power. It all unraveled instantly in that devastating moment, brutally revealing the man he truly was beneath the billionaire's mask. A deserter, a liar, a coward, the cruel and unwitting architect of the absolute misery of the only woman he had ever truly loved. "Rebecca," he finally managed to whisper, his voice a broken sound, unrecognizable even to himself. Hearing her name spoken with an intimate and disturbing familiarity that shouldn't belong to that unknown man, that opulent house, that life of luxury, Rebecca finally looked at him with focused attention. She scrutinized his mature face, analyzed his eyes, and under the expensive, polished mask of the successful billionaire, she gradually began to see and recognize the unmistakable features of the boy who had cruelly haunted her sleepless nights for so many years. The unique shape of his eyes, the particular way his mouth curved even now in pain, the line of his jaw. Her jaw dropped, her mouth opened in shock. The air escaped violently from her lungs in a sharp gasp of horror and recognition. Her dark eyes instantly filled with an ancient, deep pain, of a monumental betrayal that all the time in the world had not healed, nor even eased. "No, it can't be," she stammered in disbelief, taking an instinctive step back, pulling her daughter protectively with her. "It's not possible." But it was the girl, innocent and oblivious to the emotional storm of the adults, who sealed all their fates. Frightened and confused by the growing electrical tension between the adults, little Sarah lifted her delicate face and looked directly at Arthur with childlike curiosity. And he saw his own eyes reflected back at him. The exact same color, the same distinctive shape, the same penetrating intensity. It was literally like looking into a magic mirror of time, seeing himself as a child. He looked at the frightened girl, a girl of about 8. He had abandoned Rebecca 9 years ago. The math was brutally simple and undeniable. The child at his door, hungry, scared, vulnerable, was not just the daughter of the woman he had cowardly abandoned. She was his daughter, his own flesh and blood. Arthur's carefully constructed world shattered violently into a million sharp pieces. The lingering pain from Helen's death, the crushing guilt for abandoning Rebecca, the traumatic shock of discovering a daughter he never knew existed. It all converged simultaneously into a single unbearable point of absolute agony. Standing there at the imposing door of his empty and silent mansion, under the merciless sun, he was not Arthur Vance, the respected tech titan, the powerful billionaire. He was just Joe, the poor, dreamy boy who had made a sacred promise and broken it in the most devastating and irreparable way possible. And the past he had desperately tried to bury under a gigantic mountain of money and success had finally come to collect its unpayable debt, and the debt had his exact eyes. The name Joe, whispered in the trembling voice of a ghost from the past, violently broke the paralyzing spell that had ensnared Arthur. That affectionate nickname, a precious relic from a life he had tried to bury under 12 long years of corporate success and cold concrete, abruptly brought him back to the brutal reality of his doorstep. Before him, Rebecca trembled visibly, her face as pale as wax from shock, the old hatred and deep pain of betrayal warring intensely in her dark eyes. She had recognized him completely now, and the recognition brought no nostalgic joy or relief, but an even deeper and more visceral horror. I didn't know it was you," she stammered desperately, taking another instinctive step back, the primal instinct to flee becoming stronger than the absolute desperation that had brought her to that door. She clutched her daughter Sarah to her chest with protective force, as if to physically shield her from him, from this man who was the living embodiment of all her broken promises and shattered dreams. "Forget what I said. It was a terrible mistake. Let's go, honey, now." She turned rigidly, ready to dive back into the cruel street, to face the corrosive hunger and terrifying uncertainty again. Anything, absolutely anything, to avoid accepting pity or charity from the man who had so completely destroyed her life. The humiliation of begging a stranger for food was absolutely nothing compared to the unbearable humiliation of asking him for it, the man who had promised to love her forever and had simply vanished. "No." Arthur's voice boomed, a command born of the pure primal panic of losing her again, of watching her disappear for the second time in his life. He moved forward without thinking, and driven by desperate instinct, firmly grasped her thin arm. The physical touch was electric, almost painful. A powerful current of 12 whole years of unresolved history, of unsaid words, of unlived love, passed violently between them in that simple contact. They both felt the shock to their bones. "Please don't go. Please," he pleaded, his voice breaking. "Come inside. It's a very hot day." The girl, She urgently needs water, a place to rest, to recover. The words came out completely clumsy, stupid, inadequate. He, a consummate master of business negotiation, a man who could move entire financial markets with a single well-placed phrase, now couldn't form a single minimally coherent thought. His privileged mind was an absolute chaos of emotions. Rebecca here, alive, real, touchable. And the girl. Good God, the girl who had his exact eyes, his daughter. The word echoed incessantly in his stunned mind like a gigantic cathedral bell. Deafening, overwhelming, terrifying. Daughter, I don't want your help, Arthur. Rebecca spat with venom, trying to wrench herself free from his grasp. The anger in her voice was the concentrated force of a whole decade of pent-up fury, of nights crying alone, of unanswered questions. I didn't need you for 9 whole years. I don't need you now. I'd rather humbly beg on the street, sleep under bridges, accept anything from anyone, than accept a single penny that comes from you. Those words were like sharp knives being repeatedly stabbed, each one penetrating deeper into his already lacerating guilt. But it was the innocent child who finally broke her iron resistance. Sarah, suddenly awakened by the palpable and frightening tension in the air, began to cry. Her weak, tired, sick cry, the devastating cry of a chronically ill and deeply hungry child. "Mommy, my tummy hurts so much," she murmured faintly, her small, feverish face pressed against Rebecca's sweaty neck. "Please, Mommy." In that heart-wrenching instant, the internal battle within Rebecca ended abruptly. Her wounded pride, her justified anger, her immeasurable pain, all instantly bowed before the primal and urgent need of her daughter. A mother's love conquered all. She looked at Sarah's tearful, feverish face and then, slowly, at the man before her, the ghost of her past. And in her dark eyes he clearly saw the bitter defeat, the painful surrender of a mother who would do literally anything for her child, even, and this was killing her inside, accept the desperate help of her greatest ghost, her greatest tormentor. Without another word, because there were no adequate words for that moment, Arthur gently guided her into the mansion. As he closed the heavy, solid wood door, he physically felt as if he were closing a mystical portal to the past, locking it inside with him, trapping the ghosts in his own home. The oppressive silence of the gigantic mansion seemed even heavier, more suffocating with their contrasting presence. It was like two completely opposite worlds colliding violently. Rebecca and Sarah's journey into that place was a brutal collision of parallel universes. They walked slowly through the monumental entrance hall, Rebecca's tired feet leaving faint dust marks on the flawless, gleaming Italian marble. Sarah, who had momentarily stopped crying, now looked around with wide eyes of pure astonishment, her mouth half open in silent shock. She had never in her short life seen such an absurdly high ceiling, a floor that shone like a mirror, a space so vast and frighteningly empty. It was like entering a forbidden museum or an intimidating cathedral. "Please sit," Arthur said nervously, pointing with a trembling hand to a huge Italian white leather sofa that probably cost more than all the miserable houses Rebecca had ever rented in her life combined. He felt like an uncomfortable stranger in his own luxurious home, a completely clumsy and unprepared host for the living ghosts he had just invited in. He ran, almost tripping, to the kitchen, a cold environment of gleaming stainless steel and high-end technology he almost never used, and returned quickly with a crystal glass of ice water and another of fresh, whole milk. He carefully handed the milk to Rebecca. "For her," he said softly, his voice still deeply unstable, almost unrecognizable. Rebecca took the glass with both hands, visibly trembling. She helped Sarah drink slowly, and the girl drank the milk with a desperate eagerness that literally broke Arthur's heart into 1,000 sharp pieces. Every gulp was a silent accusation. While the child drank greedily, Rebecca looked around the opulent room, absorbing every painful detail. She saw the priceless paintings by renowned artists on the walls, the modern sculptures, the designer furniture. Each object was a silent but eloquent testament to his monumental success, to the extraordinary life he had meticulously built without her, while she struggled to survive. Each absurd luxury item was a heavy brick in the gigantic wall he had built between his humble past and his golden present. A wall that now, ironically, had completely crumbled. She felt tiny, dirty, inadequate, a displaced intruder in that intimidating sanctuary of obscene wealth. It was at this tense moment that a new figure dramatically entered the scene. Sterling, the impeccable butler and head of security, had returned early from his scheduled day off. He entered the living room elegantly and stopped, completely petrified at the unusual scene before him. His face, normally a perfect mask of impassive professionalism, visibly contorted into a complex expression of genuine shock and ill-disguised disapproval. "Sir," he said coldly, his voice like ice, his critical eyes slowly moving from Arthur to Rebecca and the child, as if clinically analyzing a potential security threat. "Are you all right? Who are these people?" The word people was pronounced with a subtle but unmistakable contempt that made Rebecca instinctively shrink, feeling even smaller. To Sterling, a man whose entire life was loyally dedicated to protecting Arthur from any complication, from any inconvenient remnant of his poor and undesirable past, the sudden presence of these two was like a fire alarm ringing. He instantly saw an opportunistic grifter, a woman from a dark past who had conveniently appeared to calculatingly exploit his widowed boss's known wealth and loneliness. "Everything is fine." "Sterling," Arthur replied with effort, trying to sound firm, the word guests sounding strange, almost surreal in his own mouth. "They are my guests. Please prepare a guest room immediately, the best one we have, and urgently ask the kitchen to prepare a light, nutritious soup, fresh chicken soup, and some assorted fruits. Quickly, please." Sterling stared at him, the disapproval crystal clear in his experienced gaze. "As you wish, sir," he said with a stiff, formal bow before silently retreating. But the message was absolutely clear to everyone in the room. He was the unyielding guardian of the castle and would not easily accept these suspicious intruders. His loyalty was to the old order, to the memory of Helen. His hostile presence added a new heavy layer of tension to the already electrically charged atmosphere. With Sarah's most immediate and urgent need finally taken care of, the dense silence returned, settling heavily between the two adults, absolutely full of unsaid questions, silent accusations, of a past that throbbed between them like an open wound. Sarah, completely exhausted by the traumatic day, fell asleep again in Rebecca's protective lap. Arthur watched her intensely, his heart a devastating mix of sharp pain and terrifying fascination. His daughter, his own daughter, was there just a few feet away, breathing softly, and he was a complete stranger to her. "A nobody, nothing. We need to talk," he said finally, breaking the oppressive silence. The voice came out firmer than he expected. He carefully led her to the imposing library, the same sacred place where hours before he had melancholically contemplated his deep loneliness and empty life. He let her sit in a soft leather armchair while he remained standing, unable to stay still, pacing nervously back and forth like a desperate caged animal. He didn't know where to begin. "I'm sorry" seemed like a bad joke, far too inadequate. "What happened?" Was too cruel, as if he didn't know exactly what had happened. "How did you find me?" he asked finally. The first question he could formulate, although he knew it was the wrong one. "I didn't find you. I wasn't looking for you at all," she replied, her voice still laden with a cold, controlled anger. "I was just desperately looking for a roof over our heads, a minimal place to spend the night safely. My daughter has been sick for days. We were cruelly evicted from the miserable little room where we lived yesterday morning. The owner needed the place for his son. I walked all day through the city, under this sun. I humbly knocked on dozens and dozens of doors. No one gave me a single chance. Everyone slammed the door in my face." She looked at the impeccable facade through the huge window. "And then I saw this mansion and thought, whoever lives in a place like this has so much money they won't miss a little food." She laughed, a bitter, humorless laugh. "What a cruel irony of fate, isn't it? To have all the thousands of doors in the world, I had to come knocking of all places on yours." Her story was a brutal succession of blows for Arthur. Evicted, starving, her daughter sick. Each word was a direct accusation, a painful reminder of his monumental failure as a human being. "Rebecca, he began, his voice failing. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know any of this. I swear I didn't know." "You didn't know?" She interrupted him abruptly, her eyes flashing with suppressed fury. "Of course you didn't know. How could you know from up high in your golden castle? You completely disappeared, Joe. You solemnly promised me you would come back. I waited like an idiot. I wrote you dozens of desperate letters that all came back with a cruel address unknown stamp. I looked for you for months, asked everyone. And you? You just vanished from the face of the earth, built your brilliant empire, and left me behind as if I were a disposable piece of trash from your old... Poor life. The devastating torrent of 12 years' worth of pain and resentment came flooding out like a dam breaking. I was young, foolish, naive. I blindly believed in you. And when I needed you most, when I found out... She stopped abruptly, swallowing hard, instinctively glancing towards the ajar door, as if to make sure Sarah was still sleeping peacefully. It was the moment, the question that hung heavily between them, the truth he already felt painfully in his bones, in his soul. When you found out what, Rebecca? He asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. Say it. The girl, Sarah. She took a deep breath, trembling. She is... He couldn't finish. The question was too big, too heavy, too terrifying. Rebecca stared at him, and in her eyes was all the accumulated contempt in the world, all the pain of a decade. Yes, Arthur, she said, her voice hard as a diamond, sharp as glass. She is your daughter, the daughter you never knew existed because you were too busy, too important, becoming the powerful king of the tech world. The verbal confirmation was the final, definitive blow. Arthur leaned heavily on the mahogany desk, his legs weak, the world spinning. His daughter. An 8-year-old daughter. A whole complete life he had absurdly missed. The first wobbly step, the first lost tooth, the first babbled word, the birthdays, the nighttime fears, the midnight fevers. He hadn't been there for any of it. He had been a completely absent father, a ghost who didn't even know of his own existence. I found out I was pregnant exactly 1 month after you left, Rebecca continued, her voice breaking now, the tears finally starting to fall. I tried to tell you in every way possible. I called all the numbers you had given me, all disconnected. I sent letters, telegrams, nothing. You had already completely discarded me from your life. My entire family turned their backs on me in hatred. They called me a disgrace to the family, a whore. They kicked me out of the house. And I raced her alone, completely alone, every single damn day, every endless night, cleaning other people's dirty floors, washing mountains of dishes in restaurants, doing any humiliating job that came my way, so she would never go truly hungry. So she would have the minimum of human dignity, the dignity her father denied her from before she was born. Arthur slid slowly to the floor, his back against the wall, unable to stand. Tears streamed freely down his face, uncontrolled. A daughter. He had a daughter, and he had abandoned her before she was even born. He looked at Rebecca through the tears that blurred his vision, at the weathered face of a woman who should have shared a lifetime of joys with him, but who instead had carried the crushing burden of both of them alone. Her strength, her unwavering resilience, the unconditional love that had kept her standing even when everything was falling apart, it all crushed him, suffocated him. He wasn't even worthy of being in the same room with her. He wasn't worthy of breathing the same air. He tried to speak, but there were no words in the English language or any other that could express what he felt. What could he say? Apologies were gross insults. Justifications were pathetic lies. All that remained was the naked, raw, brutal truth of his catastrophic failure as a human being. The status quo of that immense house had been permanently, irrevocably broken. There, under the same opulent roof, were 3 people united by blood and separated by a seemingly impassable abyss of pain and lost time. Arthur, the father who had just shockingly discovered his daughter. Rebecca, the warrior mother who would never completely forgive him. Sarah, the innocent girl sleeping peacefully in a luxury room, completely oblivious to the fact that the kind, rich stranger who had taken her in was the father she had never, ever known. Arthur walked slowly, as if in a trance, to the door of the guest room Sterling had prepared. He opened it silently, almost reverently. The soft light from the hallway illuminated the scene that would be etched in his heart forever. Sarah slept soundly, a small, fragile figure lost in a huge bed of Egyptian silk sheets. She looked like a delicate fairy tale princess, but he knew with a painful certainty that her life had been a cruel nightmare. And he was the monster in the story, the villain who had abandoned the heroine. The question that echoed incessantly in his tormented soul as he watched his unknown sleeping daughter, was no longer what happened. He already knew that painfully. The question now was much more terrifying, much more impossible. What do I do now? How do I fix what seems irreparable? He could give her an entire castle, but he didn't know how to give her a true home. He could give her the whole world on a silver platter, but he didn't know how to be her father, how to earn her love, her trust. Arthur Vance's journey was just beginning, and the road ahead was a treacherous minefield of crushing guilt, justified resentment, and the fragile, almost impossible, distant hope of redemption. Arthur's mansion, once a silent sanctuary of self-imposed loneliness, dramatically transformed into an invisible battlefield of unspoken emotions, meaningful glances, and eloquent silences. The air was constantly thick with the suffocating weight of 12 years of unresolved history, deep-seated hurt, and a guilt so palpable it seemed to have a real physical presence wandering through the luxurious rooms. They lived under the same opulent roof, but inhabited completely different planets, cautiously orbiting the same small, fragile, and frightened star, Sarah. For Sarah, the sudden change was like a confusing and surreal fairy tale. She woke up, disoriented in a bed that literally felt like a soft cloud, in a private room larger than all the miserable places she had ever lived in combined. There were new, expensive toys she had only ever seen in inaccessible shop windows, an expansive garden that looked like an enchanted forest from a storybook, and a huge refrigerator that, by some incomprehensible magic, was always full of fresh, delicious food. She didn't fully understand the constant electrical tension between her mother and the sad man with kind eyes, who was the mysterious owner of the house. But she smelled the wonderful aroma of hot food 3 times a day and felt the comforting touch of clean sheets every night. And that, for a child of only 8 who had known so much deprivation, was paradise on earth. For Rebecca, however, the mansion was a suffocating golden cage. Every absurd luxury item, every priceless work of art hanging on the walls was a painful and constant reminder of the extraordinary life Arthur had meticulously built without her, of the gigantic social chasm that now separated them. She had agreed to stay, but only exclusively for her daughter, only for Sarah. Her wounded pride was an impenetrable armor, and she moved through the immense house with an almost military defensive dignity, politely but firmly refusing anything that wasn't strictly necessary for survival. She ate the gourmet food offered to her, yes, because Sarah needed to eat well. But she spent most of her days isolated in the guest room with her daughter, deliberately creating a small, safe territory of normalcy amidst the ostentatious opulence that suffocated and intimidated her. Her genuine gratitude for Sarah's physical safety fought a constant and exhausting internal battle against the deep and justified resentment she felt for the man who had caused her so much immeasurable pain. For Arthur, their presence was simultaneously a psychological torture and an unexpected blessing. With every crystal-clear laugh from Sarah that echoed through the empty corridors, his heart broke a little more with the sharp, painful awareness of the precious years he had stupidly, irretrievably lost. He tried to approach his daughter clumsily, like an insecure teenager. He bought the most expensive toys on the market, the most beautiful clothes from the best children's stores, but he simply didn't know how to cross the invisible but solid wall of silence and timid fear that separated him from the girl. Sarah was naturally shy with him, instinctively sensing the deep hesitation and poorly disguised pain in his intense gaze. He was the kind Uncle Joe, the good, generous man who had taken them in when they desperately needed it. But the magic word Dad was an entire universe away, an abyss. His unavoidable interactions with Rebecca were even more complex and fraught with tension. Conversations were invariably short, strictly functional, always revolving exclusively around Sarah's practical needs, never about them. "She needs a specific medicine for her cough," Rebecca would say coldly, avoiding looking directly at him. "The new private school uniform you bought is 1 size too big," she would point out precisely. And he, desperate to repair the irreparable in some way, tirelessly tried to fix everything with money, the only language he perfectly mastered. "I will immediately hire the best pediatricians in the country for Sarah, a specialist in pediatric pulmonology, a renowned nutritionist," he would say anxiously. I can enroll you in any course you want, Rebecca. What did you always dream of doing? College? Arts? You were always so talented. I don't want your charity, Arthur. She would cut him off icily, her voice as cold as ice. I am here exclusively for my daughter, for her safety. As soon as I can find a decent job and a minimally suitable place to live, we will leave. And you can go back to your quiet life. The real threat of losing them again, of watching them simply disappear from his life, was a constant and paralyzing panic for Arthur. He knew intellectually that he couldn't keep them there by brute force or money. He desperately needed time to prove his worth, to show that he had changed. And he needed to understand the true depth of the abyss they had fallen into. How had Rebecca, a woman so obviously intelligent, strong and capable, reached that extreme point of total desperation? What had happened in 9 years? Driven by this urgent need to understand, he did what he always did when he needed concrete answers. He hired the best professionals. He discreetly engaged a highly reputable and absolutely discreet private investigation agency. The mission was delicate and specific, to meticulously retrace Rebecca's steps over the past 9 years, without invasive surveillance, without violating her privacy, just a careful review of public records, respectful interviews with former neighbors and ex-colleagues. He desperately needed the complete map of her journey of pain. While the investigation ran silently in the background, the conflict within the house gained a new and formidable combatant, Sterling, the loyal butler. The man who had devotedly served Arthur's late wife, Helen, saw the sudden and inexplicable arrival of Rebecca and Sarah not as a romantic reunion or a second chance, but as a sacrilegious profanation. He was the self-proclaimed guardian of Helen's memory, of the established order, and of the traditional stability of that house. And Rebecca, in his experienced and suspicious eyes, was chaos personified, an inconvenient relic of a poor and complicated past that, in his conservative opinion, should have remained permanently buried. His hostility was subtle but sharp as a razor. He always referred to Rebecca as the lady, but with a particular intonation that made her feel like an imposter, a fraud. He would accidentally leave framed photographs of Arthur and Helen smiling in strategic places where Rebecca often passed, constant visual reminders that she didn't belong there. His seemingly innocent conversations with Arthur were full of carefully disguised venomous jabs. "Mrs. Helen had impeccable and refined taste for the flowers in the living room, didn't she, sir?" he would say purposefully while Rebecca was nearby organizing books. "She would never allow yellow tulips here. She said they were too common, vulgar." The subliminal message was crystal clear. You don't belong in this sophisticated place. One night, when the tension was already unbearable, he confronted Arthur, directly in his private office, closing the door carefully. "Sir," Sterling began, his voice a strange mix of habitual subservience and pure steel, "with all the deep respect I owe you, after so many years of service, I must express my serious and genuine concern." Arthur looked up wearily from the papers he was pretending to read. "Go on." "The presence of these people is drastically altering the routine and peace of this house that took so much to build. Mrs. Helen, may God rest her soul, built this home with such care, such refinement." He paused deliberately. "Are you absolutely certain you are not being cruelly deceived? A convenient woman from the past who appears just now that you are widowed, vulnerable, lonely, with a child who could be anyone's. It seems like a very well-rehearsed, very convenient story. Scammers are sophisticated these days, sir." "Enough, Sterling!" Arthur exploded violently, slamming his fist on the desk, his anger finally overpowering his usual composure. "Rebecca is not a scammer, and the girl is my daughter. Look into her eyes and tell me you don't see the obvious truth." He stood up, towering. "They are staying here, and you will treat them with the utmost respect and deference they deserve as members of this family. Is that absolutely clear?" Sterling visibly recoiled, shocked as much by the bombshell revelation as by his usually controlled boss's unbridled fury. As you wish, sir," he muttered with a stiff bow. But Arthur saw clearly in his experienced eyes that the butler's loyalty was not really to him, but to the old order, to the sacrosanct memory of Helen. Sterling would not be an ally in this new phase. He would be a dangerous obstacle, a spy within his own walls, patiently waiting for a slip-up, for proof that he was right. The investigation began to yield its first disturbing results after 2 intense weeks. They were painful fragments of a life of constant, degrading struggle. The confidential report meticulously detailed Rebecca's jobs over the years: waitress in a popular restaurant that went bankrupt after 6 months, cleaner in a third-rate hotel from which she was summarily fired because of a serious illness of Sarah's that forced her to miss 3 consecutive days. 3 days that cost her her job. Subcontracted seamstress in a small exploitative local garment factory that paid less than minimum wage. It detailed the miserable addresses, a depressing succession of tiny rooms rented in noisy, dirty boarding. Houses each progressively poorer and more dangerous than the last. A descent down a ladder of degradation. And it detailed the devastating loneliness. No real close friends, no family willing to offer support after they kicked her out. She was a solitary island adrift, desperately fighting alone to keep herself and her daughter minimally afloat, above the line of absolute poverty. Each page of the report was a new painful stab to Arthur's already lacerated heart. He read about her unimaginable hardships, the days without eating so Sarah could have at least one meal, the exhausting double shifts, the daily humiliations, and he vividly remembered the luxury dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, the frequent first-class trips for international conferences, the money he casually spent on absolutely unnecessary frivolities. The brutal dissonance between their 2 parallel lives was so violent, so obscene, that it made him physically sick, wanting to vomit. Then came the final report, the document that explained the total and definitive collapse that had desperately brought her to his door that fateful day. The investigator, a discreet and professional man named Mr. Davies, sat respectfully across from Arthur in the silent library, the thick folder on his lap. "Mr. Vance," he said gravely, carefully opening the folder, "what we've discovered about the last few months is particularly disturbing." Arthur leaned forward, tense. "Go on. I need to know everything." Ms. Miller's final downfall began exactly 6 months ago. She had managed to get what seemed to be the best job of her difficult life, a permanent position as a specialized seamstress at a small but respected uniform factory called Reliance Textiles. The salary was decent by her standards. She was formally employed for the first time in years. For the first time in a very, very long time, she had real stability, hope for a better future. Arthur felt a tiny drop of relief. At least she had had a moment of peace, of dignity. But 4 months ago, Mr. Davies continued, his voice growing darker, Reliance Textiles was acquired, a corporate takeover, by a much larger conglomerate called Avestra Textiles. And as unfortunately always happens in these cases, the new management arrived with an aggressive policy of cost optimization and restructuring. Arthur's heart began to slowly freeze, a terrible premonition forming. Avestra Textiles initiated a brutal process of mass layoffs. The list strategically included all employees with less than a year of service to avoid higher severance costs. Ms. Miller was on that list. She lost her job overnight. Without her salary, she couldn't pay the 2 months of back rent she owed. And the landlord, an inflexible man, legally evicted her without any mercy. That's what literally put her on the street, with absolutely nowhere to go. The story was tragically common, another brutal example of the impersonal cruelty of the modern corporate world. But there was still a piece missing from the puzzle, the final piece that would turn tragedy into an unbearable personal nightmare for Arthur. And who owns this conglomerate? Avestra Textiles, Arthur asked, although a dark, terrified part of his soul already sensed the answer. Mr. Davies hesitated visibly, uncomfortable. He slowly opened the last page of the detailed report and pushed it across the polished desk. It was a complex corporate flowchart. At the top of the pyramid, a holding company called Homeland Investments Group. Below it, several subsidiaries including Avestra Textiles. And above Homeland Group, at the absolute top of the corporate food chain, was a single name, a single familiar logo that dominated everything: Vance Tech, Arthur's company. His company, his empire. He sat paralyzed, staring at the paper, at his own name printed at the top of that gigantic power structure that, at its lowest and most invisible base, had brutally crushed the woman he loved. The air rushed out of his lungs. The luxurious room began to spin uncontrollably. It wasn't blind fate. It wasn't cruel chance. It wasn't God testing them. It was him. Himself. He hadn't just abandoned her 12 years ago in a dusty bus station. He had continued to abandon her, to hurt her, to destroy her every damn day without even knowing, without even imagining. His incessant corporate quest for exponential growth, for strategic acquisitions, for ever larger and more obscene profits. The executive decision he had, probably casually, approved in a 5-minute meeting about restructuring non-essential assets, had been the final kill shot in Rebecca's already difficult life. He wasn't just the painful ghost of her past. He was the unwitting yet still responsible architect of her present ruin. Arthur stood up, staggering, unbalanced, and went to the huge window. He looked out at the impeccably manicured garden, where at that very moment Sarah was running happily after colorful butterflies, laughing, a pure sound he was beginning to love deeply. An innocent girl laughing carefree in a garden bought with the money that had literally cost her mother her job and her home. The guilt he had felt before was a shadow. What he felt now was a dark, deep, and infinite ocean, and he was drowning, unable to breathe. The revelation was not just a disturbing fact, it was a final verdict, and he had been judged and condemned by his own cruel history, by his own actions. Now the question was no longer how to repair the distant past. It was how to survive the present, knowing that he personally was the monster in the love story of his own life. The truth was simultaneously a deadly poison and a necessary antidote. For Arthur, the shocking revelation that his own company had been the unwitting weapon that delivered the devastating final blow to Rebecca was the absolute bottom of his pit of guilt. He spent the entire night sleepless in the library, wandering like a ghost. The investigator's detailed report remained open on the desk like an irrevocable death sentence. He stared at his company's logo, Vance Tech, a symbol that had always represented his meteoric success and hard-won power, and now he could only see the indelible crest of his own unwitting but real cruelty. He wasn't just a troublesome ghost from Rebecca's distant past. He was the complete architect of her tragedy, from beginning to end. The man who had abandoned her, and the man who, years later, unknowingly destroyed her last chance at stability. The pain was so intense, so overwhelming, that it paradoxically transformed into a strange, cold, crystalline calm. The chaotic panic gave way to an iron resolution. There was no more room for empty apologies or clumsy attempts at reparation through easy money. There was only one possible path forward, the hardest, most terrifying, most risky one, the path of full and complete confession. The next morning, the atmosphere in the mansion was even more tense and heavy than usual. Rebecca kept herself and Sarah in a kind of dignified, voluntary exile in the guest room, only coming out for meals, which they ate in a charged and uncomfortable silence at the enormous dining table that could seat 20 people. Sterling, the unyielding butler, constantly watched them with the piercing gaze of a hunting falcon, every one of their gestures a silent criticism in his conservative mind. He seemed to have deliberately intensified his psychological Cold War campaign, accidentally playing the classical music that Mrs. Helen had loved so much, Chopin, Debussy, Mozart on the sophisticated sound system, constant sonic reminders of the old order. Arthur waited patiently for Sarah to be happy and distracted in the playroom, an entire room he had hastily set up, filled with expensive dolls, imported building blocks, and educational games that the girl still didn't quite know how to interact with, and respectfully asked Rebecca to sit with him in the library. She came, but suspicion was etched in every cautious step, her protective armor of pride firmly in place around her wounded heart. "What is it now, Arthur?" she asked wearily, crossing her arms defensively. "Another expensive gift you want me to accept to temporarily ease your guilty conscience?" He didn't answer immediately. He silently pointed to the comfortable armchair opposite his desk. When she finally sat stiffly, he surprisingly did not stay behind the imposing desk, his traditional position of power and authority. He humbly sat in the armchair beside her, completely leveling the playing field. Two human beings, not a billionaire and a maid. He carefully pushed a thin folder across the coffee table between them. "I hired a private investigator, Rebecca," he began, his voice low and grave, laden with pain. "I needed to understand deeply. I needed to know how things got to this extreme point." "Understand what?" she retorted bitterly. "That life is brutally hard for those who aren't born with a silver spoon in their mouth like you? That's no secret to anyone." "No," he said firmly, looking directly into her eyes. "To understand specifically why you lost your last job at that uniform factory." "Reliance Textiles." Rebecca stared at him, genuinely surprised. How do you know the specific name?" "I know everything now, Rebecca," he said, his voice full of a soul-deep weariness. "I know it was finally a good job, that you had stability for the first time in years. I know you were starting to have hope for a better future." He took a painful pause, mustering all the courage he had left. "And I know exactly that the factory was bought by a larger conglomerate called Avestra Textiles, and that they fired you and dozens of others in a cold, calculated corporate restructuring." He took a deep, trembling breath. "What I didn't know until last night. What completely destroyed me was the name of the real owner of that conglomerate that ruined your life." He opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside was a single printed document, the corporate flowchart the investigator had shown him. He slowly turned it so she could see it with her own eyes. Rebecca leaned in, confused, and carefully read the names in the hierarchical boxes. Avestra Textiles, Homeland Investments Group, and at the absolute top, dominating the entire power structure like a distant god, the unmistakable logo of Vance Tech. She stared at the logo for long seconds, processing. Then she slowly looked at Arthur's face. And what she saw there was not power, not corporate pride, but a shame and pain so deep and genuine that it was almost a physical confession of guilt. The intense hatred in her face faltered, trembled, gradually giving way to an expression of absolute shock and a bitter, painful, almost ironic understanding of the cruelty of fate. "So," she finally whispered, her voice devoid of anger now, just a tired and devastated astonishment. "It wasn't just blind fate. It wasn't just God testing me. It was you again, every time it was you." "I didn't know, Rebecca," he said, his choked voice breaking completely. "I swear on my mother's sacred memory, on Sarah's life, that I didn't know. To me, it was just another insignificant name in a quarterly acquisition report, a restructuring of secondary assets that some director presented to me in a routine executive meeting of maybe 5 minutes. I approved it without a second thought, without knowing a single name of those affected." He buried his face in his trembling hands, his shoulders slumped with the weight of guilt. "I destroyed your last chance to get back on your feet with dignity, and I didn't even know. I didn't care to know the human details. It was just numbers on spreadsheets, just operational efficiency." Genuine tears began to stream through his fingers. "I didn't just abandon you 12 years ago at that damned bus station, Rebecca. I continued to abandon you, to hurt you, to destroy you every day without knowing, without caring. My obsessive, blind pursuit of corporate growth, of strategic acquisitions, of ever-increasing profits, all of it had a human cost I never wanted to see. And you paid that cost. You and Sarah." For the first time since their traumatic reunion, Rebecca saw him completely broken, shattered. Not the powerful, intimidating billionaire, not the cold traitor who had abandoned her. She saw only Joe, the boy she had loved, lost and drowning in his own genuine regret. The sight of him so vulnerable, so human, slowly disarmed her protective anger. The deep resentment that had been her emotional shield for so many long years gradually gave way to a strange, uncomfortable but undeniable feeling, a sharp pang of compassion. She saw now with painful clarity what Sterling and the rest of the world couldn't see. His golden cage was as real, as imprisoning, as her cage of extreme poverty. Both were prisoners of circumstances they had created without realizing it. "Lift your head, Arthur," she said finally. Her voice was still cold, controlled, but without the corrosive venom of before. "Self-pity and tears won't fix a single thing that's been broken." His brutal confession didn't magically solve the monumental problem between them, but it fundamentally changed the dynamic forever. His devastating honesty, his genuine courage to admit his deepest and most indefensible guilt, had created the first and finest crack in the gigantic wall of ice that separated them. From that painful day of confession, Arthur radically changed his tactics. He finally understood with crystal clarity that money was not, and never would be, the answer to the real problems he had created. The true answer was time, infinite patience, and constant presence. He completely stopped offering material things and started offering something much more valuable and frightening: himself. He began to spend hours in the colorful playroom, not trying to force direct interaction with Sarah, which visibly intimidated her and made her retreat, but just being there, present, available. He would sit quietly in a cozy corner and assemble complex puzzles or draw awkwardly in a sketchbook, an artistic skill he hadn't used since his poor childhood. At first, Sarah completely ignored him, intensely focused on her new dolls and building castles with colorful blocks, but gradually, inevitably, natural childhood curiosity overcame her shyness. She began to discreetly peek at what he was doing, craning her neck. One memorable day, she finally approached with hesitant steps. "What are you drawing?" she asked, her voice soft and shy. "Is it a horse?" Arthur felt his heart literally leap in his chest, racing. "I think so," he replied carefully, keeping his voice calm so as not to scare her. "But honestly, I think it's starting to look more like a weird dog." Sarah critically observed the amateur drawing and then laughed, a crystal clear, pure, completely spontaneous laugh that was the most beautiful, most perfect sound Arthur had ever heard in his entire life. "It looks like a funny alligator with bunny ears," she said between giggles, covering her mouth with her small hands. They laughed together for the first time. The sound echoed through the silent mansion like celestial music. From that magical day forward, the sacred ritual of drawing became an inviolable daily tradition. He would draw strange, disproportionate animals, and she would give honest and sometimes brutally sincere feedback, correcting his lines with the authority of an 8-year-old art critic, inventing elaborate and funny stories for the impossible animals he created. In those precious, simple moments, he was not the intimidating billionaire or the biologically absent father. He was just Joe, the kind, clumsy friend who drew ridiculous alligators with bunny ears and laughed at himself. And from her strategically positioned armchair in the next room, Rebecca watched it all in silence, her heart heavy, and the dense ice in her wounded heart slowly, imperceptibly melted, a little more with each genuine laugh from her daughter. The psychological war with Sterling, however, intensified dangerously. The conservative butler, clearly seeing Arthur's progressive closeness to the intruders, became even more hostile and passive-aggressive. One day, Rebecca quietly went down to the immense kitchen to get a simple glass of cold water for Sarah in the middle of the night. She accidentally overheard Sterling talking on the phone in the pantry, his voice low but full of pure venom. "I don't know what's gotten into him, Lucy. It's this woman, this shameless opportunist. The house hasn't been the same since she invaded. Mrs. Helen's sacred memory is being completely disrespected, trampled on. He's blind, manipulated. Someone needs to open his eyes before it's too late, before she destroys everything we've built." Rebecca felt the humiliation burn inside her like acid. She quickly retreated to her room, her heart as heavy as lead. She really was an unwanted intruder, a threat to the established peace of that perfect house, an insult to the respectable memory of the woman who had once been his legitimate wife. Poisonous doubt corroded her determination. Maybe she really should leave, disappear completely, just as he had brutally done to her years ago. The dramatic turning point happened a few days later. Sarah woke up in the middle of the night with a high, worrying fever. Rebecca was completely exhausted, spending her third consecutive sleepless night by her daughter's bed, alternating cold compresses and obsessively checking her temperature. Early in the morning, Arthur found her in the kitchen, trying to make a medicinal tea with trembling hands, her eyes sunken and red from absolute exhaustion. "You need to rest urgently." "Rebecca," he offered with genuine concern, "please let me stay with her for a few hours. You'll end up getting sick too." At that exact moment, Sterling entered the kitchen with his usual military efficiency. "The family's private doctor has been summoned, sir. He will be here in exactly 20 minutes. He then turned slowly to Rebecca, his face an impeccable mask of ill-disguised aristocratic disapproval. If the girl had received proper medical care from the beginning, perhaps she wouldn't be chronically ill now. Young children need a stable routine and a truly healthy environment, not... The cruel insinuation was absolutely clear. It was her fault. Her life of poverty and instability. Her inadequacy as a mother. It was the final straw for Arthur. The accumulated anger he felt for himself, for Sterling, for the entire unjust world, erupted like a volcano. "Shut your mouth now, Sterling," he thundered, his voice echoing violently through the marble kitchen. Immediately, Sterling recoiled, visibly shocked, pale. Never in all his years of loyal service had he seen his master in such an uncontrolled state. "You have no right to speak to her like that," Arthur continued, advancing menacingly. "You know absolutely nothing about the proper care she heroically gave this girl alone for 8 whole years in a cruel world that cowardly turned its back on her." He walked until he was face to face with the butler, his entire body vibrating with suppressed fury. "Let's get one thing absolutely clear once and for all. This is not Mrs. Helen's house anymore. This is Rebecca's and my daughter Sarah's house. They are my family now, the only family that matters. The past is definitively over. The future has begun. And if you cannot accept that, if you cannot treat them with the absolute respect they deserve, the door you walked through all those years ago is wide open for your departure, permanently." Rebecca, watching the scene paralyzed from the doorway, literally felt breathless. That passionate defense, that public declaration, "My daughter, my family now." He was choosing her, publicly, definitively, in front of the unyielding guardian of his past, in front of the representative of his old life. He was choosing her. Sterling, pale as paper, completely defeated, just nodded stiffly. "Understood perfectly, sir," he muttered almost inaudibly and retreated in silence. The authority he so cherished turned to dust. That crucial night, after the experienced doctor had come and properly medicated Sarah, the fever finally subsided gradually. The girl slept peacefully, breathing calmly. Arthur entered the room silently to check on her and found Rebecca still awake, sitting in a strategically positioned armchair next to the bed, lovingly watching over her daughter's sleep like a guardian. They remained in deep silence for a long time, just listening to the child's soft, regular breathing, the most comforting sound in the world. "Thank you," Rebecca whispered finally, without looking at him directly. Her voice was laden with emotion. "For what you said to Sterling today. You didn't have to." "I only told the absolute truth," he replied simply. "Nothing but the truth." A new peace, fragile as glass but absolutely real, settled gently between them. A true alliance was being slowly forged, not with empty promises or easy money, but with concrete acts of defense, of genuinely shared care, of mutual vulnerability. Rebecca looked at him for the first time in days, and surprisingly, the usual anger in her eyes gave way to a sad and deep curiosity. "Why, Joe?" She asked the question she had carried for 12 years. "Why did you never come back? What was the real reason?" The question was the only key that could finally open the last locked door between them. Arthur sat down heavily in another armchair, his tired face illuminated by the faint, soft light of the lamp. The battle for true redemption now demanded the most difficult of all possible confessions, the brutal truth about his own human weakness. He took a deep breath, preparing himself. "Because I was a complete coward, Rebecca," he began, his voice low, almost a painful whisper. "That's the only true answer. All the other explanations I could give are just pathetic excuses." He stood up and began to walk around the room, as if the physical movement could help the difficult words come out. "When I left here, that small town, I was a literally starving boy, not just for food, but for everything. For success, for respect, for a real chance to prove I was somebody. And the big city, it's a gigantic monster that feeds on that desperate hunger. I dove in head first, Rebecca. I studied obsessively by day, worked exhaustively at night, barely slept 3 hours a night. And at the beginning, everything I did was genuinely for us. Every small victory, every excellent grade, every rare compliment from a boss, I thought, I'm getting closer to being able to go back to Becca." He stopped, looking out the window into the darkness. But slowly, gradually, the monster began to devour me whole. Success is a powerful drug, Rebecca, perhaps the most addictive of all. Each new step up, each new contract signed, demanded more and more of me. And I gave everything. I gave my time, my energy, my soul. Your letters? At first, They were my lighthouse in the darkness. I would read and reread them obsessively, and they gave me the strength to go on. But then they started to become a painful reminder of my growing failure. Each letter was a silent demand for the promise I was progressively breaking. And I, in my deep cowardice, began to fear them. And then I just stopped replying. He turned to her, his eyes full of an old, deep shame. I told myself it was to protect you, to free you, so you could move on with your life without me holding you back. But it was a lie. It was to free myself from my own unbearable guilt. And then I met Helen, my late wife. She was exactly what I had become. Ambitious, focused, relentless. We didn't have a love like ours, Becca. That youthful love that feels like it's going to set the whole world on fire. Ours was a cold partnership, a calculated merger of complementary ambitions. Building the Vance Tech empire became my sole reason for living, because it was infinitely easier to focus on spreadsheets and stock prices than on the giant hole in my chest, the hole that had your name carved into it. He sat down again, his body heavy with emotional exhaustion. I never forgot you, Rebecca. Not for a single day. You became my private ghost, my constant haunting. In every important meeting, at every luxury dinner, with every professional achievement, there was a persistent voice in my head whispering, "And what about Becca? What would she think of this? Where is she now?" So I became the man I am today by constantly running from the boy I was when I loved you. And the most painful truth is that that poor boy, that Joe, was an infinitely better, more honest, more human man than I will ever be. Silent tears streamed down his face. I didn't come back because I was deeply ashamed. Ashamed of having broken my sacred promise. Ashamed of the cold man I had become. And that shame, ironically, was greater than my love. I was weak, a coward. And there isn't a single day that I don't pay the terrible price for it. The brutal, completely honest, and painful confession hung between them like a cloud. Rebecca had listened to him in absolute silence, her face impassive, but her eyes, her betrayed eyes, registered and absorbed every word as if they were sacred. For the first time since their traumatic reunion, she did not see the powerful billionaire or the traitor who had destroyed her life. She saw only Joe, the vulnerable boy who had completely lost his way on the difficult path, who had been devoured by the monster he was trying to conquer. Her anger, which had been her protective shield for so long, finally began to dissolve like salt in water, giving way to a deep but not destructive sadness. A sadness for both of them, for the beautiful life they could have had together, for the human mistakes that had led them to that silent room. She didn't immediately say, "I forgive you." It was too soon for such definitive words, but she said something that, to Arthur, meant even more, something that opened a door. "You need to get some sleep. Joe, you're completely exhausted." It was a small gesture of genuine care, the first real bridge over the abyss. The fragile peace between them, however, was brutally short-lived. The crisis they thought they had overcome was just quietly regrouping for a much more violent and terrifying attack. 2 days after that revealing conversation, Sarah's fever returned with a frightening vengeance. Stronger, more stubborn, more aggressive. The girl, previously just drowsy, was now visibly agitated, moaning softly, her breathing rapid and dangerously shallow, her face too flushed. The family doctor, the renowned pediatrician Dr. August Ferreira, whom Arthur had urgently brought to the mansion, examined her with a growing concern he could no longer hide. "This isn't a simple common virus," he said gravely to Arthur and Rebecca, taking the stethoscope from his neck. "The fever isn't responding adequately to the strongest antipyretics. Her lung sounds are extremely worrying. I seriously fear it's an aggressive bacterial pneumonia, and given her advanced state, it's likely already at a critical stage." He closed his medical bag with a definitive click. "She needs to be hospitalized immediately. We can no longer treat this at home. We need full hospital equipment." Fear returned with full force, icy, paralyzing, visceral. The word hospitalized echoed in Rebecca's mind like a death sentence, instantly bringing back the terrifying ghosts of overcrowded public hospitals. Endless waiting lines, chronic lack of resources, children dying in hallways. "She'll have the best room in the best hospital, the best care available in the country," Arthur said immediately, desperately trying to reassure her, but his own voice was visibly laden with barely disguised panic. In less than a frantic hour, They were in the presidential suite of the best and most expensive children's hospital in the country. The environment was absurdly luxurious, more like a five-star hotel than a hospital. Fine wood, works of art on the walls, a flat-screen TV, a leather sofa. But all the intimidating medical paraphernalia, the flashing electronic monitors, the intravenous lines, the constant and irritating beeps, was a brutal and constant reminder of the extreme gravity of the situation. Sarah was immediately put on an aggressive battery of state-of-the-art intravenous antibiotics, but her small, fragile body struggled desperately. The fever fluctuated dangerously. Her breathing remained difficult and shallow. Her lips began to turn slightly bluish. Arthur and Rebecca never left her side for a second. They became a perfectly synchronized team, a pair of parents completely united by paralyzing fear. He obsessively handled all the complex logistics, constantly speaking with doctors demanding updates, ensuring nothing was lacking, hiring the best specialists in the country for second and third opinions. She took care of the essential. The human holding Sarah's small, warm hand, softly singing the lullabies that always calmed her, gently wiping her feverish forehead with a damp cloth, whispering words of love and encouragement. In the long, heavy silences of the hospital nights, when only the regular beep of the monitors broke the oppressive silence, they talked. Rebecca told precious stories about Sarah's childhood that he had never known. The first time she walked alone, wobbly and laughing. Her adorable stubbornness about eating broccoli, making dramatic faces. The particular way she hugged too tightly when she was scared, as if she wanted to merge with her mother. And Arthur listened, absorbed, drinking in every detail of the life he had stupidly lost, his heart simultaneously aching with growing love and deep regret. He, in turn, told her about his own forgotten childhood dreams, about the father he had lost too soon to exhaustion, about how he and Rebecca were the two halves of the same broken soul. The painful past and the uncertain present began to subtly intertwine, no longer as exclusive sources of pain, but as the colored threads of a complex tapestry that was their unique story. The main, terrifying crisis came on the third endless night. One of the heart monitors began to beep shrilly and desperately, a sound no parent should ever hear. Sarah's blood oxygen saturation was dropping dangerously, plunging to critical levels. A whole team of doctors and nurses rushed into the room, pushing them aside. "We need to get her to the pediatric ICU now," the chief physician shouted urgently, already placing an oxygen mask on Sarah's pale face. "Her left lung is partially collapsing. The infection is much more aggressive than we initially thought." They were literally pushed out of the room, into the cold, impersonal hospital corridor, as Sarah's small bed was rushed towards the ICU, surrounded by running professionals. The heavy door of the ICU closed definitively in front of them, a physical barrier brutally separating them from their daughter. What followed were the longest, most torturous, most unbearable hours of their lives. The ICU waiting room was a modern purgatory. Every minute was a painful eternity. Every second dragged on like an hour. They didn't speak, because there were no words for that moment. They just sat side by side in uncomfortable plastic chairs, united in their silent and absolute despair. The helplessness was total and devastating. All of Arthur's obscene money, all his business power, all his connections, it was all completely useless in the face of the terrifying fragility of his 8-year-old daughter's life. It was Rebecca who finally broke. The superhuman control she had heroically maintained for so many years, the unwavering strength that had made her survive everything, finally gave way completely. She began to cry, a convulsive, deep, soundless sob at first, her shoulders shaking violently. And then came the sound, a moan of pure pain that broke the hearts of everyone in the waiting room. "It's my fault," she sobbed uncontrollably, her hands covering her face. "I should have brought her to a doctor sooner. I didn't have money, but I should have found a way. I let her get sick. I didn't protect her. It's all my fault." Arthur, seeing her heart-wrenching pain, felt his own pain transform into a fierce primal need to protect her, to comfort her. He hugged her tightly. Not a clumsy hug like the first few times, but a desperate, strong, complete embrace. He pulled her to him forcefully, letting her cry without reserve on his shoulder, letting her tears soak his shirt. "It's not your fault, Becca," he whispered repeatedly into her hair, using the old nickname tenderly, holding her as if she would break. "It's not your fault." It never was. "You kept her alive against all odds. You were her hero all these years. The blame is entirely mine for not being there, for not taking care of you both when you needed it most." "I can't lose her, Joe," she cried desperately, clutching his shirt tightly. "She's all I have in the whole world. She's the only good thing I've ever done in my life. I won't survive if she—" "We are not going to lose her," he said with an iron conviction he forced into his voice, trying to pass on a certainty he didn't feel himself. "She's strong, Becca. Strong like her mother. She's going to fight and she's going to win. I promise." In that tight embrace, amidst the antiseptic smell of the hospital and the omnipresent fear of death, the final defenses between them fell completely, turning to dust. They were no longer Arthur and Rebecca, the billionaire and the ex-girlfriend. They were no longer Joe and Becca, the teenage sweethearts. They were simply a terrified father and mother, desperately holding on to each other like two lone castaways in the middle of a violent storm. Their alliance was definitively sealed in that moment of absolute despair, not by a contract or a confession, but by the shared fear of the most unbearable loss of all. The chief physician finally appeared at the door of the waiting room hours later, his face visibly tired, his white coat wrinkled and stained, his glasses fogged. They immediately separated, standing up, holding their breath, gripping each other's hands with painful force. "We did it," Dr. Ferreira said, his voice exhausted but carrying an unmistakable trace of relief. It was a difficult medical battle. The infection was extremely severe and aggressive. We had to perform an emergency drainage procedure on the left lung, insert a chest tube. He took a deep breath. But she responded well to the procedure and the antibiotics. She's an incredibly strong girl, you know, much stronger than she looks. Her oxygen saturation is gradually rising, stabilizing. The fever has started to break. She's past the worst of it. She's going to be okay. She will make a full recovery. The wave of relief was so violent, so overwhelming, it almost knocked them over physically. Rebecca fell to her knees on the cold hospital floor, her hands covering her face, now crying from pure gratitude, from indescribable relief. "Thank God! Thank God!" Arthur leaned heavily against the wall, his legs trembling uncontrollably, feeling as though he had aged 20 years in those last hellish hours. When they were finally allowed into the pediatric ICU, they saw Sarah in a modern incubator, surrounded by tubes, wires, and flashing monitors, but breathing calmly and regularly. Her small chest rose and fell in a steady, hypnotic rhythm, the most beautiful sound in the world. She was alive, alive. They stood there, hands intertwined, looking at their daughter through the glass of the incubator. The outside world, with its opulent mansions, its billion-dollar companies, its hostile butlers, it had all completely disappeared. The only universe that truly mattered was contained within that small space of glass and monitors. The terrible crisis had pushed them to the absolute limit of what was bearable, to the precipice of the abyss, but in the process, it had completely burned the bridges of resentment and pride that separated them. They had entered that hospital as two broken people, separated by the past. They left it as a true family, forged in the fire of fear and united by the sacred promise of a shared future. Sarah's discharge from the hospital, 2 long weeks later, was not the end of the ordeal, but the true first day of the rest of their lives as a family. The girl returned to the mansion no longer as a temporary guest or a tolerated intruder, but as the absolute princess of a kingdom that was now rightfully hers. The serious illness had left her body visibly fragile, and recovery was a slow, delicate process that required infinite patience and constant care. And it was precisely in this daily care that their family, newly born from the ashes, learned to breathe in perfect unison. Arthur plunged into fatherhood with the same obsessive intensity he had previously dedicated exclusively to his business. He cancelled all his international trips planned for the next 6 months. He delegated 90% of his executive responsibilities, advanced tech, to trusted directors. And he transformed the mansion into a true dedicated recovery center for his daughter. He patiently learned to measure her temperature correctly, to give her medicine at the exact times, to prepare the nutritious fruit purees the nutritionist had specifically recommended. The nights that were once filled exclusively with corporate reports and urgent emails were now entirely dedicated to reading stories to Sarah until she fell asleep peacefully. He read about enchanted and magical worlds, about brave dragons and kind fairies, and in every story he read, he secretly tried to rewrite his own, desperately trying to be the hero he had never been. Rebecca at first watched this radical transformation with a natural and suspicious caution. It was profoundly difficult for her, who had been the sole impenetrable wall of protection for her daughter for 8 long years, to suddenly share that sacred role with someone. But it was absolutely impossible to deny the total genuineness of Arthur's effort. She heard him wake up alone at 3 in the morning to check on Sarah's breathing. She saw the genuine frustration in his eyes when the girl stubbornly refused to eat. And she saw the pure childlike joy on his face when Sarah finally laughed at one of his silly faces or bad jokes. Slowly, gradually, she began to lower her defensive guard, to allow him to be a real father, to allow them to be parents together. They became a perfect synchronized team. They spent hours talking about Sarah's small daily progress, about their shared fears and growing hopes. The conversations were no longer exclusively about the painful past that hurt them. They were about the future they were trying to build together for their daughter. The abyss that separated them was being slowly but surely filled by small daily bridges of trust and shared purpose. However, the old order of the house still fought desperately to survive, stubbornly embodied in the unyielding figure of Sterling. The conservative butler saw the new family dynamic not as evolution or healing, but as a chaotic disorder, an unacceptable breach of protocol that deeply insulted the memory of his former and revered mistress, Helen. He kept the house physically immaculate, fulfilling his duties, but his discontent was a cold, constant presence, a persistent reminder that Rebecca and Sarah were, to him, intruders who did not deserve to be there. The final definitive confrontation happened on a rainy Sunday afternoon. Rebecca was in the kitchen preparing a special, healthy snack for Sarah, a recipe the nutritionist had recommended. When Sterling entered, he ignored her completely as if she were invisible and began giving curt orders to one of the new maids. "Ensure that the dining room crystal is polished exclusively with the specific imported product," he said coldly. Mrs. Helen was extremely particular about that. She had high standards, impeccable standards, that this house seems to be progressively forgetting. The jab was direct, intentional, cruel. Rebecca felt her blood boil, the humiliation burn. But before she could respond or swallow another silent insult, Arthur's firm voice sounded from the doorway. "Sterling," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight of authority the butler hadn't heard in a long time. "Come to my office now, immediately." In the silent library, Arthur didn't shout. He didn't lose control. He was surgical, precise, definitive. "Sterling," he began, looking directly into the older man's eyes, "I owe you a great deal. You took care of this house, of me, and of Helen's memory with impeccable loyalty for many difficult years, and for that, I will be eternally grateful. You have my respect." He paused meaningfully. "But that phase of my life is definitively over. Mrs. Helen is gone, and this house has a new lady and a young heiress. Their names are Rebecca and Sarah. They are my family, the future of this house, my future, and your constant attitude towards them has been unacceptable." Sterling tried to defend himself, straightening his back. "Sir, I was only trying to maintain the standards that Mrs. Helen's memory will always be honored in this house," Arthur cut in firmly, "but it will never be used as a weapon to hurt my present family. I understand perfectly that this change is difficult for you. That is why I'm giving you a clear and definitive choice." He pushed a thick envelope across the desk. "You can stay, accept the new reality completely, and treat Rebecca and Sarah with the respect and deference they deserve as my future wife and my daughter. Or," he pointed to the envelope, "you can accept this severance package. It is extremely generous, enough for you to retire comfortably anywhere in the world you choose. The decision is yours alone. But it must be made now, this very moment." Sterling looked at the heavy envelope, then at his master's determined face, and he saw clearly that the hesitant man he had served for the past few years had completely disappeared. In his place was a king fiercely protecting his kingdom. The butler, a man of the past, a man of old orders and outdated loyalties, understood that his time there was definitively over. He took the envelope with dignity. "It has been an honor to serve your family all these years. Mr. Vance, I sincerely wish you happiness." and with a final respectful and formal bow, he departed forever. The last anchor tying Arthur to his old life had finally been cut. With Sterling's departure, the mansion finally began to truly transform into a home full of life. The rigid rules were gradually relaxed. The sound of Sarah's crystal laugh echoed joyfully through the once silent corridors. Rebecca, finally feeling more secure and accepted, began to blossom like a plant finally receiving sunlight. Arthur, noticing that she spent hours drawing and painting in a notebook alongside Sarah, lovingly set up a surprise small, complete art studio for her in one of the empty guest rooms, with canvases of all sizes, high-quality professional paints, assorted brushes, and everything an artist could dream of. Rebecca, who had completely abandoned her natural artistic talent to survive day to day, rediscovered her old passion. She painted compulsively. She painted vivid landscapes of her simple childhood, the river where she had sat with Joe, the brutal country sun. And she painted emotional portraits of Sarah in various moments, sleeping, laughing, playing. And slowly, timidly, she began to paint Arthur. Not the intimidating billionaire in an expensive suit, but the real man who read stories with funny voices to his daughter, the father who pushed the swing in the flower-filled garden, who drew ridiculous alligators with ears. Her paintings were a visual chronicle of her progressive healing, of the delicate reconstruction of the months turned into seasons. Sarah was fully recovered, a healthy, vibrant, and happy girl. Arthur and Rebecca's relationship had deepened immensely, transformed from a youthful, idealized romance into a mature, solid partnership based on deep respect and a rediscovered love infinitely stronger than before. On a beautiful spring afternoon, exactly 1 year to the day, she had desperately knocked on his door. Arthur took her for a special walk in the garden. The place was completely covered in colorful flowers he had specially planted, not expensive, exotic flowers, but simple ones she loved: daisies, sunflowers, wild roses. He led her to a stone bench under a spectacular flowering tree. "Exactly 1 year ago," he began softly, holding her hands tenderly, "you came to my house humbly asking for a job, for food, for shelter, and instead you gave me a whole life. You and Sarah brought me back from the world of the emotionally dead. You taught me how to feel again, to truly live." He knelt before her, a gesture that perfectly mirrored her plea at his door a year earlier, but which was now charged with a completely different and sacred meaning. He took a small velvet box from his pocket. Inside was not an ostentatious, vulgar diamond, but a simple and elegant platinum ring with a single, small sapphire the exact color of her eyes. "Rebecca," his voice trembled with emotion, "I spent 12 years building an empty empire on the foundation of a broken promise. Now I want to spend the rest of my life building a true home on the foundation of a new promise, one that I will never, ever break. I don't just want to be your daughter's father. I want to be your partner, your best friend, your husband. I want to wake up beside you every day, face the storms together, and celebrate the sunny days. I love you, Becca. I love you more deeply than that boy who left you behind, because now I know your true worth, and I know mine." Tears ran down his face. "Marry me. Let me finally fulfill the promise I made so long ago. Let me be the man you always deserved." Rebecca, her eyes filled with tears of pure happiness, did not hesitate for a second. "Yes," she whispered emotionally, smiling through her tears. "1,000 times yes, Joe, yes." He placed the ring on her finger with trembling hands, and there, in that fragrant garden, the painful cycle of separation closed definitively, giving way to a perfect circle of true love. The final scene takes place 2 years later, on a sunny Saturday morning. It's Sarah's 11th birthday. The mansion's garden is unrecognizable. It is no longer a formal, silent, intimidating space. It is absolutely full of life. Colorful balloons everywhere, children's music playing loudly, tables with sweets and snacks, and dozens of children screaming, running, and playing joyfully. It's a real birthday party, noisy, chaotic, wonderful, and pulsating with life. Arthur and Rebecca, now officially married for a year, watch the beautiful scene from the veranda, hand in hand. He's not wearing a suit. She's not wearing expensive jewelry. They are just an ordinary father and mother, looking with infinite love at their daughter, who runs happily and completely healthy among her friends, laughing non-stop. The house is no longer a silent mausoleum. It is a true home full of love and life. Sarah runs up to them, her adorable face smeared with chocolate from the cake, a radiant smile lighting up everything. "Daddy! Mommy, come play with us!" she shouts, hugging them both tightly. Arthur lifts her into his arms easily, kissing her face tenderly. Rebecca lovingly adjusts a lock of hair from her daughter's forehead. In that tight three-way hug is the perfect picture of complete happiness. A hard-won, deserved real happiness. One of Sarah's little friends, running wildly, trips and spills a full glass of orange juice near Arthur. The liquid stains his light-colored pants. The boy is terrified, freezing. "Sorry, mister," he stammers in fear. Arthur just laughs loudly, not caring. He gently puts Sarah down and kneels in front of the frightened boy. "Don't worry, champ," he says with a genuine smile. "It's just juice. Stains come out easily. The important thing is to keep playing and have fun." He looks at Rebecca over the child's shoulder, and they share a deep smile. A smile that holds the memory of other stains, of other accidents, of a difficult past that almost destroyed them, but in the end, united them forever more strongly. The transformation was complete. The man who had closed himself off from the world because of a loss, who had built walls of loneliness, now opened his arms completely to life, to messiness, to imperfect and real love. Grateful for every small and wonderful stain of happiness, Rebecca comes closer, hugging Arthur from behind, resting her head on his shoulder. "You did it, Joe," she whispers just for him to hear. "You came home. For real." He turns and kisses her softly. "We did it, Becca, together." And there, surrounded by the sound of happy children, under the warm sun that once separated them and now warmed them together, they finally found what they had always been searching for. A home, a family, a love that survived the impossible. So what did you all think of this emotional story of love, forgiveness, and second chances? Did Arthur earn his redemption? Was Rebecca brave to forgive? Leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel for more heart-touching stories, and comment what moment moved you the most. Want more stories like this? See you next time.